Hi, welcome to this short screencast on radiation protection legislation in New Zealand, our favourite subject. So, the all radiation protection legislation in any country follows international recommendations. It's a health issue, so the World Health Organization, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and other agencies feed into the recommendations. All of the legislation, when applied, is intended to keep anyone working with radiation, any members of the public, and in our case, the animal patients, everybody's dose as low as reasonably achievable. It's all in the application of what's reasonable in practice. So all of the guidelines are applied around these three principles. So keeping the time as short as possible that you're exposed. So less times your finger is on the button or your thumb, the better. So avoiding repeats is a key factor. Distance, so 2 to 3 meters from the primary beam is what's recommended, and shielding if you are closer to the beam than that. So exposure to radiation is a health issue. The legislation is applied by an agency that falls under the Ministry of Health because of that. So exposure to low levels of radiation over time can cause cell mutations that can lead to cancer, and the fetus is particularly vulnerable to damage from radiation. So as veterinary nursing is dominated by women of childbearing age. The fetus is particularly vulnerable in the first 3 months of pregnancy, and although the doses in our particular job are low, they accumulate over years in practice. So just a brief history on the legislation in New Zealand. The Radiation Protection Act of 1965 it covered all medical uses of radiation, so that included veterinary use, and under that fell the Radiation Protection Regulations of 1982. Now the law was amended around that time, like a number of industrial laws in New Zealand around the time of the Think Big projects that the government was at the time trying to attract international investment into New Zealand. So radiation protection legislation was changed at that time. Under those protection regulations fell the Code of Safe Practice for the Use of X-rays in Veterinary Diagnosis, so that's the C21 code, which for practical purposes is what we are still using today. Even though the law was changed in 2016, the Radiation Safety Act was passed in November 2016, and there's a new code of practice for veterinary use of X-rays that is still under development 4 years or three and a half years later. That's less than ideal. It has been out for public consultation, and that consultation is now closed. We're still waiting for it. The guidelines at the moment that or the instructions that are issued by Veterinary Council is that, and by the Office of Radiation Safety, is that we as veterinary users of X-rays should apply the old Code of Safe Practice until the new one is available. Again, just a slight bit of history, because if you're researching around, you might find reference to the NRL, the National Radiation Laboratory, that was around from the 1950s until 2011. It was based in Christchurch, and there were some changes after the Christchurch earthquakes that split the agency, the government agency that applies radiation safety legislation, into two. So now the National Centre for Radiation Science falls under the ESR, which is the Crown Research Institute. So it's still a government body, and they are all staffed by scientists and physicists. They apply the technical aspects, so they offer services in calibrating machines and testing. So they'll run dosimeter tests. They're there for technical advice. And they train people in the use of radiation sources in New Zealand. And the other part that it was split into is the Office of Radiation Safety, which falls under the Ministry of Health, and that is just administrative in function. So it administers the legislation. So when you're looking for information about the law, you go to the Office of Radiation Safety. Okay, so you find the information on the Ministry of Health website. If you Google Office of Radiation Safety New Zealand, you'll find it, and all of the information you should require about applying the legislation about radiation safety plans and things is on this website. Any technical information you need, you go to the ESR agency. So as we're still using the old code that fell under the old legislation, then we would be looking to that code for our information now. So we're particularly interested in part 2, radiation safety management, in which you'll find a radiation safety plan. So any veterinary clinic that's running an X-ray machine must have a radiation safety plan. It must be available for audit. And one of the things inside it that will apply to you specifically is that you have to receive training and induction in the use of any X-ray machine, and you're actually legally required to sign that you have received training and you've read the radiation safety plan and that you agree to abide by it in practice. So the Diploma of Veterinary Nursing is considered appropriate training for someone to use an X-ray machine in practice. So if you hold that qualification, you're trained to use an X-ray machine. However, you still need to be trained to use that particular equipment in practice. The other part of the radiation safety plan that really applies to veterinary nurses is in quality assurance. So there's a whole list in the plan, in the radiation safety plan, of the different quality assurance processes that need to be undertaken. And it's veterinary nurses that often, are in charge of this sort of stuff. So it's about systems and processes being well maintained and efficient, and really about avoiding repeat x-rays, making sure that every time you take an x-ray, it's your best work. So you don't want to be doing radiography by trial and error. You want to make sure that everything is in place for that to be the best diagnostic image that you can achieve. So when there was chemical processing at play, there were a lot of different technical aspects that had to be lined up and working well to make sure that a diagnostic image was achieved. It's not just as technical now with digital machines. I think a lot of that skill and expertise has fallen away. However, there's still plenty that nurses can do to make sure that you get good quality images. A lot to do with positioning, real attention to detail, and getting positions absolutely right, being consistent, getting the same views every time, learning your anatomical landmarks, making sure things are not hurried, and high quality work. So lastly, In the radiation safety plan, it states that you must, so if any piece of legislation that says you must, that is not a recommendation, that is an absolute, you have to do this. So you must be following written local rules designed to keep radiation doses to all personnel as low as reasonably achievable. So people often wonder what the local rules are. So you should find somewhere within your radiography room a sheet of paper on the wall which lays out the rules that everybody has to do if they're using the X-ray machine. There should be warning lights and lines on the floor, and people should be, avoiding manual restraint and those sorts of rules. So the reason they're called local rules is that uses of machines can change depending on where they are and what they're used for. So there should be a set of rules that are written for that particular situation that everybody has to follow, and that's what the local rules are. So you should be able to locate those in your practice, and everybody should know where they are and have read them and be following them. Um, just a last word on as low as reasonably achievable. This is all that is required to be following radiation safety law, is that everybody is working to do this. So it's really all in hinges on the word reasonable, and whether there are situations where people need to be closer to the primary beam where you can't apply distance, whether patients are sedated and anaesthetised. Sometimes things are contentious around whether it's reasonable to expect that a patient should be have a radiograph taken without being sedated or not. It is really up to each individual practitioner to apply these principles how they see fit.